So I run clinical trials, which means studies involving human subjects of meditation-based interventions for the purpose of different therapeutic benefits. So, for example, one of the studies I'm currently running is on people who suffer from major depression and to whom we give an intervention known as mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or they're randomized to either that or an intervention based on progressive muscle relaxation and education about depression. In another study, we have patients with chronic low back pain that are given an intervention known as a mindful self-compassion, which is also a different method for practicing meditation that may have some benefits for chronic pain.
What are some of the problems with how the media portrays meditation science?
So some of the problems with the way that neuroscience research is portrayed in the media is that it is simplified to the point that it makes it look like specific brain areas are activated only during specific tasks or thoughts. So for example, there's this popular notion of your brain on X, so your brain on love, your brain on anxiety, to the point that, for example, a region like the amygdala, which is actually involved in many different functions, has been caricatured as the anxiety center or the fear center, when in fact it is also activated, for example, with positive emotions or anything really that attracts our attention. So in this oversimplistic representation, there's obviously going to be major discrepancies between what the science actually is trying to show or is saying at this point in time and what the public thinks it's saying. One more general problem around that is that in the scientific world, we understand that each paper, each publication, is really just one brick in the wall, like one piece of the global narrative that we are collectively building. But the media tends to extract each individual article as its own final proof of something. And so you would see headlines such as, "Science finds the meditation center in the brain." But then, of course, the next year, science again finds the meditation center in the brain, and it's not necessarily the same. So this is really confusing to the public because there are contradictory results in science all the time, which we scientists are comfortable with. That's part of what we deal with. We understand that this is how it works. But the public gets really confused whenever there's a new result that seems to contradict the previous result and the previous result. And then it seems as if anything goes, that science just doesn't know anything. And that's how it can lead to these major issues that we see nowadays in the public discourse about science, in alternative facts, in like all of these consequences of science losing its credibility, because the representation of it does not take into account the process of discovery as we scientists build it. Specifically with meditation science, which is so new and is itself based on methods that are themselves so new and limited, it's very easy to get carried away because the topic is exciting, the images are compelling, but the narrative is still in the process of being built and is most likely wrong as it is today. And we scientists try to remember that, and even for us, sometimes it's hard. We can also ourselves get carried away by these narratives and how they are reverberated in the general public. But so we all need to be really careful about that, especially in very, very new fields like meditation neuroscience.
Many of the scientists who are studying meditation are themselves Buddhist. Does this bias their findings?
So people often ask how one can study meditation and be a meditation practitioner oneself, because it seems like this would be a source of bias. And sure, but then, an exercise physiologist could also have a regular jogging practice and think it's very beneficial, and then be biased also into thinking this is beneficial and my research will prove it. So I think the problem of bias is definitely there, but it's by no means unique to our field. I think it's true across many different aspects of science, but it's really important to keep in mind, because being aware of one's own biases, one can then design experiments in such a way as to minimize the impact that this bias may have on the way the experiment is run, the results are analyzed, the results are interpreted. And so we have methods to account for that and minimize bias in the way that we conduct our research.
What are some ways that scientists who are studying meditation can reduce bias in their research?
So for example, to avoid bias, the person who maybe designed the experiment or wants it to go a certain way should ideally not be involved at all in collecting the data. So in my case, for example, I don't interact with the participants in the study of contemplative practices that I'm running, and I let that be done by other members of my lab, because I'm going to be the person analyzing the data. So at the time when I analyze the data, I want it to be completely anonymous, and I want to not have had the opportunity to influence these people by interacting with them. Then another example is after your data is analyzed and you see your results, how are you going to interpret them? It's good to consult with multiple colleagues, especially those who may hold opposite views or who could be devil's advocates, to make sure that the way we interpret it is not unnecessarily biased towards your own beliefs. Even in the analysis methods themselves, there are ways in which bias could be introduced surreptitiously. And so ways to prevent that are, for example, to decide ahead of time, even before you start collecting the data, which hypothesis you will be testing and using which statistical methods, and to publish it. And we're coming to the point when we are more and more required to do so by the funding agencies that pay for this research to be done, and by the journals in which the research will be published. They expect us to publish ahead of time the protocol and the hypothesis and the statistical methods, so that we cannot, after the fact, change the way we do the analysis until we find something that we like better in case the results don't look like what we expected. So this is really important, because this happens a lot, and it's very easy to fall for this, even subconsciously, to just keep digging in the data until we find something that seems like it's what we want. And that's called fishing for results, and that's a big no-no in science, except that many people do it with or without awareness of doing it. So the more we can have rules and collective checks and balances around this process, the better we can guard ourselves against these biases.
When scientists and Buddhists talk about consciousness, are they talking about the same thing?
Whenever you bring two very different worldviews in contact that have not been really exposed to each other very much, there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a language problem, first of all, and translation is extremely hard when words that do not match, are used to translate, both ways. So, for example, what comes up oftentimes is discussions around consciousness. The word consciousness in English has already multiple meanings, and then it's translated into Tibetan, for example, as the word namshe, although it could also be 5 other words, because depending on context, right? And when the translator chooses namshe, the implication is that this is basically a level of cognitive, even cognitive is too loaded of a term, but some kind of a mental capacity or process that exists in every living being, down to, insects, down to even potentially invisible ones. And that there's no good correspondence of that in the English term consciousness. Because usually, colloquially at least, when people say consciousness, they mean conscious awareness, that you're at least awake and you have some awareness of what's going on. So already sleep, for example, is not considered a conscious state in the English sense. Whereas Namshe pervades you throughout your life, throughout stages of sleep, and even, in this case, beyond death in some form. Maybe not with the translation Namshe, I'm not sure, but, mind will continue in some form. So they're not even talking about the same thing. So we have, for example, discussions in neuroscience about awareness, or like attention without, was it attention without awareness, or awareness without attention? Like, we can differentiate the two. We can say, if you pay attention to something, you may not be aware of other things, but still they will influence your thoughts or your behavior even later on, as we saw. Or you can be aware without really having much attention, or things like that. And these distinctions don't make sense if you use the word Namshe, because Namshe, it just doesn't work, So you start having these statements in English that, when translated into Tibetan, are self-contradictory. And so people just get stuck, already just from the linguistic level. So then, even if you try to unpack that and you say, okay, let's not translate Namshe with consciousness, let's just use the respective terms. And translators have come to do that. Like, they would speak in Tibetan and then say consciousness, in the middle of their Tibetan sentence, because they want the audience to remember, like, this is a construct for which there's no real good translation. And likewise, you can say Namshe in English, and meaning what they mean. Even if you try to unpack that, you find that you still get into these assumptions that are part of the worldviews on both sides that are just irreducible. Like, nobody is willing to even question them. Like, for example, the fact that in Namshe is immaterial and has no beginning and no end. That's just part of the definition of it. So how can you discuss with somebody who says, no, consciousness ends at the time of death? You can't even have the conversation. It just doesn't. So people just get really stuck. And it's very hard to have these dialogues unless parties on both sides have some, at least, exposure, hopefully some education, like some actual training in the other side's view, enough that they can make sense of it, even if they may not adhere to it. But at least they kind of know where it's coming from, and all the assumptions behind it, and the whole worldview, or at least some of the worldview behind it.